Okay, welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our session called True Storytelling in Science, the Why and How. My name is Dr. Lisa Cantrell. Lisa, you can call me Lisa. I am an associate professor at Sacramento State in California. I'm also the executive director of a nonprofit called Capital Storytelling. A little bit about how I got to this point and why we're sitting in this room today talking about storytelling. I got my PhD at Indiana University. I saw someone who is in Bloomington right now in our chat room. And then after I got my PhD in psychology, I went to UC Davis, University of California, Davis, where I studied what I thought was riveting science. It was looking at infant attention and memory and eye tracking infants. And while I was there doing my postdoc, I got really interested in understanding how to talk to the public about the kind of science that we were doing. And so for a short period of time after my postdoc, I worked in science journalism. So I was in science communication. I produced stories for NPR, for my own podcast back before people even really knew what podcasts were, and also for a couple of different research news media outlets before then joining Sacramento State as a professor. Storytelling has personally changed my life on a very personal level. But my real love is using storytelling to communicate science to people and thinking about how do we teach people about science. I will be facilitating today along with Tammy Spence, Dr. Tamara Spence, and I'm going to let her introduce herself so you can get to know her a little bit. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so you can see us a little bit better. So Tammy, I will let you introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So my name is Tammy Spence, and the brain is truly my first love. I am a general neuroscientist by training, and I hold a PhD in worry, and that's a true statement. For most of the past decade, I have worked as a scientific consultant for a company that specializes in the sale and support of non-invasive neurophysiological research devices. I know it's a mouthful, but my favorite part of this job is connecting with scientists, learning about their research programs, helping them overcome challenges in the lab, and celebrating their successes with them when they discover something new or when they publish their findings. I have always been a people person, and I believe that sharing true personal stories is a powerful way of establishing human connections. We all have a reason or reasons for pursuing a career in science, and I really hope that by participating in today's webinar, you will leave with some tools to help you identify and develop your own story so that you can share your stories with the greater scientific community and with your friends and families.
Fantastic. A couple of housekeeping. So John O'Bear, who is also a scientist, is with us today. And I will pin John just so you can see him really fast. Add pin, you see him. And I do that because if at any point during today's session you need help or you have a question, you should text him, chat him, because Tammy and I sometimes can't see the chat room. So he will be there to add some tech support and answer questions. You can private message him or message the whole group. And he will also be dropping in some links for people today. All right, fantastic. Well, I'm going to share my screen and then we are going to jump into the why and the how of storytelling. Let me bring it up here. Y'all can see my screen, right? Perfect. Okay. So why do we use storytelling in science? Okay, well, being a scientist myself, I believe in data. So I'm going to tell you about a little bit of research really quickly. We actually know from psychological research that when you get information in a story form, you remember it better, you engage with it better. Okay, so in some of these studies that they've done, they've given people facts like about Newton's laws of physics, and they've either done it just kind of in a list form or they've told them these facts in a story form. So explaining, he had this question and then he noticed this and then he discovered this. And then later on, when they test people, keeping everything else constant in terms of how much did they read, how long did they read these stories or these bits of information, it turns out that the people who read the information in a story or a narrative remember that information longer. Why is this the case? Well, I don't have lots of citations on this next point, but one hypothesis is stories are just more engaging. So stories have components in them that we as human beings have developed and evolved over time, but they also really engage our brains, like tension and stakes and a pivotal moment or a climax. And we like stories. And I don't think I have to give you lots of slides for this to simply say how much we like them. We spend billions of dollars globally on stories every year. We spend them on video games. I don't know if people in here are gamers. If you are a gamer, you know that most video games are story-based, like the ones that everyone loves. They have a story. We spend lots of money on movies, TV shows, Netflix, Hulu, books, and theater. All of these are stories. Okay, we like stories. So many of you are here today, I think, because someone has told you, hey, you know what? When you're talking about your science, you should use story. And it kind of stops there because it's just a buzzword and we don't quite know sometimes like what that means, like what would a story look like. I want to clarify something before we get started today, and that is that there are two forms of storytelling within science. Okay, data storytelling and then true storytelling. So what do we mean when we say data storytelling? Well, data storytelling is taking the components of stories and applying it to how we talk about our data or our findings, our results. So what I mean by that are, for example, components of a story might be tension and stakes and a resolution, a pivotal moment. How do we take those components and then put them into our research and talk about why we're doing the research that we're doing, or why did we do the experiment we're doing? So taking those components to talk about data. There's also true storytelling, which is what it sounds like, and that is telling true stories about, maybe something that we've done in the field in our research, or why we developed a question, but using true stories to engage, persuade, compel, and explain our science and our research. This webinar, we could spend tons of time on either one of these alone, but we have only 50 minutes today, so we're going to focus on true storytelling today, okay? So why and with who do we share true stories in science? If you are a scientist in the room, and I know not everyone is a scientist, some people just came because they're interested, totally great. But if you're a scientist in the room, I think we have been trained and conditioned to believe that we should be very objective and that the data should speak for itself. And why would I tell a personal story to the public? Because it's kind of like muddying the water when I really just want to tell them facts. But I want to explain why we would tell stories either to the public or even to other scientists. So why and with who we tell true stories. The first is the reason that comes to mind, which is a public-facing reason, right? So when you go out and you're talking to your stakeholders, you're trying to get some grant money from a foundation that doesn't really, they're not a science foundation, they're interested in, the greater good of the world. How do you explain to them why your science should be funded? Potentially non-scientists, stakeholders, and the public, just getting the public interested in what you're talking about. Using true stories engages them for all the reasons we talked about, right? So it is more interesting to them, it engages our brains. It also creates a connection with people, okay? One of my favorite anecdotes that I tell people when I talk about using true storytelling in science is my grandmother. So I remember when I was doing my dissertation research, and I thought it was just riveting. I was studying infant numerical perception, and we were using like this habituation procedure, and it was so cool to like look at all the data and like everything that people had done, and there were all these inconsistencies, and I was just going on and on one day telling my grandmother about this in her living room, and I was like getting worked up, and I look over and my grandmother is falling asleep. And I felt like, oh, dang, I felt a little hurt. But then I realized like it doesn't make sense to her. Maybe if I had told her about something that had happened within the lab, a true story, she might have engaged and actually understood a piece of what I was doing, asked questions, and I could have told her more. But I actually shot myself in the foot by not using story. The other people that we use stories with is not just the public, but I think something we forget about is using stories within the science community, okay, with each other. And I want to pause here because I think many of you, again, you came into the room today, and I totally believe in talking to the public about science, and that's what I love. And that's why a lot of you came. But we don't think about using stories with each other because we think when we walk into a research group or a lab, we are there to do business. We're there to be objective, to talk about the hypotheses, the theories, and the abstract concepts. So why would we tell stories to one another? There's a couple of reasons. One is storytelling actually pulls out empathy and makes us feel connected. And if you think that doesn't matter, Let me challenge that belief. When we feel connected, when we feel supported in a group, it allows us to be more creative. It gives us a sense of belonging. So if you want to create a research group or a community that is trying and failing, but moving science forward, you want to create a space where people feel safe to try and fail, where they feel supported, where they feel a sense of belonging. And I think this also plays into a lot of, what I think we are finally seeing, which is equity and diversity in our science and our science field. We need to create spaces where people feel belonging. Otherwise, I think we are, again, shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of our science, because we are not allowing people to feel creative, and we're not allowing people to feel belonging, and we're actually stifling some of our science. So telling stories to each other, I think, helps us do this, helps us connect, helps us create belonging, helps us feel less criticized so that we can actually innovate and ask big questions. I think it's also important to think about telling stories to each other, even within, I've been a part of lots of lab meetings when we're talking about the experiments we're doing, and we get really caught up in all the abstract terms, but just telling a story of, this thing happened, and I had this question, it might actually spur new questions that wouldn't otherwise be asked. So thinking that way, thinking about how do we use storytelling to drive our science forward. I know Tammy has really strong opinions about this part too, about using stories within the science community. So I'm going to let her speak to this as well.
Thanks, Lisa. So in graduate school, I was often intimidated by the idea of giving a talk or asking a question after someone else had finished giving a talk. I resented how judgmental academia felt. I remember many times where it seemed like the audience was so fixated on poking holes in the science that they seem to forget that the person on stage or up in front of the podium, that they're like an actual human being. I know that I craved a more compassionate environment where scientists could work together to advance their fields. In college, I had the luxury of being part of a team of scientists who had the same goals, drives, and curiosity that I did. We had so much fun learning how to do science, and I will forever cherish those memories of the time we spent together. I believe that there's so much to be learned by opening up to one another, by allowing ourselves to be vulnerable, by sharing our origin stories, sharing our struggles, sharing what motivates us. By sharing our stories, we allow ourselves to be known and to know others. We can connect on a deeper level to create that more relaxed environment where creativity and science can flourish.
Awesome. Thank you, Tammy. So we've spent a little bit of time today. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. We spent just a sliver of time, about 10 minutes here, trying to convince you, I think, about why you might want to use storytelling in science. True storytelling to engage the public, but also thinking about using true storytelling within the scientific community to create belonging, to create space where people can innovate, try and fail, and feel safe to drive our science further. But now I think we're going to move into the how. So we've talked about, okay, yeah, you should all use true stories in your science, but what does that even look like? So Tammy is actually going to share with us her origin story. So how she got into the research that she does. She has a PhD in I think it's cognitive psychology, but she's a neuroscientist. I'm not sure is it clinical psychology?
General neuroscience.
General neuroscience. She's going to talk to us about how she got into worry, specifically studying that. And I want to give you a couple of instructions as you listen. So again, speaking to the scientists, including myself in the room, we have been trained, I think, as scientists to be very critical, to think, judgmentally, and I think in a good way, because we're constantly trying to figure out the holes in our experiments and what's going on, and it's correlational, and there's a confound. But I want to encourage you for the next 10 minutes to shift off that part of your brain, just as an exercise to see what it feels like, and as you listen to Tammy's story, and to observe how you feel as you listen to Tammy's story. So yes, I'm asking you to be a little more soft and fluffy for the next 10 minutes. And to listen non-judgmentally, and to just understand how it makes you feel to listen to Tammy's story. So I'm going to quickly do a breathing exercise with you. So breathe in, and then breathe out, and say, I'm not going to be critical, and I'm going to listen delightedly. And we're going to listen to Tammy share her origin story. So I will pin you, Tammy, so that everyone can see you. And please welcome to the stage, Tammy.
Thank you so much. So we're going to call this my anxiety origin story because it's the truth. I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder right before I started college during a pap smear. As I laid exposed on the exam table, feet up in the stirrups, I covered my eyes with my hands and tried to distract myself by making a to-do list of what I would do later that day or thinking about the classes that I would register for later that semester. Granted, pap smears are not the most comfortable experience, but apparently my reaction to the insertion of the cold silver duck lips was so extreme that my doctor felt compelled to inform me of generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. I remember her pointing to a symptom checklist on the back of the door. She asked me if I worried a lot, if I felt anxious. I brushed it off thinking, I hate pap smears. So I got dressed, left the doctor's office, and didn't think twice about GAD. I went on to major in neuroscience. I studied psychopharmacology and became fascinated by individual differences in vulnerability to substance use and abuse. My curiosity about addiction led me to continue my education and pursue a PhD at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the home of big tobacco. At Wake, PhD students are strongly encouraged to spend 8 to 10 weeks in 2 or 3 labs to learn some research skills and assess the overall fit before deciding where to complete their doctoral training. My second research rotation was in an alcohol lab that used a technique called blind whole cell patch clamp electrophysiology. Imagine sitting in front of this floating table surrounded by a copper mesh cage. Inside of this cage is a microscope, and on this stage is a super thin slice of mouse brain suspended in artificial cerebrospinal fluid. The goal of patch clamping is to gently lower a glass pipette tip onto the surface of the brain slice. Use a bit of suction, which you apply with your mouth, to pop open a tiny hole in the cell so that you can record changes in the electrical environment as a result of whatever's happening in the environment. If you patched one cell and managed to keep it alive for the duration of an experiment, that was considered a successful day. My first day attempting to patch cells, I patched 5. When the principal investigator of the lab heard this news, he burst through the doors to the lab and begged me, "I will give my right arm to have you join my lab." I laughed and told him that it was probably just beginner's luck and encouraged him not to chop off any limbs. But secretly, I was pumped. I have always liked a challenge, and patching cells was hard, but I seemed to have a knack for it. So at the end of my rotation, I decided to join the lab full-time. I studied brain mechanisms underlying alcohol withdrawal-induced anxiety, and given my personal interest in understanding addiction, I was right where I wanted to be, and life was great. I was patching cells left and right, and I felt on top of the world. I took so much pride in my accomplishments in the lab. I would hang screenshots of my best cells on my refrigerator door, like a proud parent hangs their kid's finger paint art. But about halfway through my second year of graduate school, I lost my magic touch for patching cells. I don't know how it happened, but after a couple years of being a rock star patch clamper, I was suddenly inept. There were days when my top lip would bleed from all the failed attempts at trying to open a cell. But I kept trying, and I kept failing. Trust me, I wanted to fail better, but I just failed harder. And that failure nearly destroyed me. I withdrew from my friends and family, and the wave of negative emotions that came over me, it honestly scared me. So I sought help and ended up being prescribed a cocktail of drugs, including Xanax, just to keep my emotions at bay so that I could continue my work. The drugs did not provide me with any noticeable relief, but being a persistent budding scientist, I was determined to identify the root cause of my failure. So I spent months changing one variable at a time. Eventually, when I managed to patch a cell, I would inevitably have the displeasure of watching it shrivel up and die under a microscope. I felt helpless. To make matters worse, while I lost the ability to patch cells, my colleague Steve, a self-proclaimed slacker who had never read a scientific paper to completion and only applied to Wake Forest because it had a basketball team that he'd heard of, Steve was on fire. During those dark days, the principal investigator of the lab would periodically poke his head into the lab. I remember him seeing Steve's computer screen on which this fat, happy cell sat dancing, and he would just exclaim, "Wow, Steve, you are brilliant." Then he would look over at my computer screen on which this flat line was sitting there, indicating 0 patched cells. And he would say, "Keep trying, Tammy. Do something different. Do something different." I remember thinking that this may be the universe's way of challenging me to ensure that I was on the right path. If I were to make it through this dry patch, then I could prove to myself and to the principal investigator that I was really suited for this line of research. So I continued. But after several months, I began to feel insane. After all, I was doing the same thing every day and honestly expecting a different outcome. By the start of my 3rd year of graduate school, I began to think about leaving the program. But I had only one more class to take to fulfill the didactic portion of my education. It was clinical neuroscience, for which students had to gain clinical experience in a field related to their basic science interests and submit a term paper about translational neuroscience. You know, taking science out of the lab and into the real world where it can actually impact public health. Given my work on alcohol withdrawal-induced anxiety, I asked to shadow a clinical psychologist who'd be teaching a lecture on anxiety towards the end of the semester. It turned out that she specialized in the treatment of generalized anxiety disorder. There it was again, GAD. And she was about to start a longitudinal study to see if acoustic startle reactivity could be a biomarker for the effectiveness of exposure therapy in older adults with GAD. She asked if I'd be interested in helping with data collection. Do something different. My advisor's words echoed in my ears. So I leaned into this opportunity and embarked on my first human subjects research study. I spent a lot of time startling anxious older adults with short, loud bursts of white noise. And I liked it, but not because I'm a sadist, because I really connected with these people and I enjoyed witnessing them get better over the course of the study. As the semester went on, I found myself spending less time sitting in front of my cage trying to patch cells and more time reading about startle, GAD, and worry, and thinking about potential translational research projects. In my review of the literature, I began to see myself in the descriptions of people with GAD. I remember having this aha moment when I realized that my OBGYN from college was right. I did have GAD. It was when I learned that people with GAD are often less sensitive to benzodiazepines due to changes in the protein structure of their GABA A receptors. That really hit home. Remember that Xanax that I'd been prescribed to help me cope with the loss of my magic touch at patching cells? Well, now I had an explanation for why it didn't work for me. But it was more than just my defective alpha-gamma interface at play. There were so many idiosyncrasies about me that I thought were just part of my personality. I overprepare, I hate surprises, I cannot make decisions, I am an empath. In retrospect, all of these traits are consistent with generalized anxiety, and I had been living with it for years. At the end of the semester, I submitted my term paper on startle reactivity as a potential translational method for understanding GAD, and I went home for the holidays. I knew that I wanted out of the patch clamp world, and I didn't see any way forward in my current lab. So I applied for a leave of absence to give myself some time to think about transitioning out of graduate school. I've never considered myself a quitter, but I started to think that maybe I wasn't actually cut out for a career in science. I was devastated. When I returned to Winston-Salem in early January, the director of the neuroscience program and the director of the clinical neuroscience course asked to meet with me. they staged a mini intervention. They were surprised by my request for a leave of absence, and they wanted to present me with a counteroffer. They explained that they were impressed with the translational studies that I had proposed in my term paper. They thought that the rationale was solid and the experiments were practical, which meant doable. They asked me, what if the graduate program gave you an opportunity to do the research outlined in this proposal? My jaw just dropped. How would that even be possible? They told me that the neuroscience program wasn't ready to lose me, that they believed in me, and they would come up with a way to make this happen. I needed some time to think about it. Essentially, I would have to start over when it came to research, and that terrified me. What PhD student changes labs halfway through their doctoral training? Someone who likes a challenge. In the end, I found myself drawn to the literature on GAD. The science was so bleak. GAD is the #1 diagnosed anxiety disorder in primary care settings. And it is a difficult anxiety disorder to treat, in part because it's often comorbid with major depressive disorder. But neuroscientists were beginning to study GAD separately from other anxiety disorders. And I wanted to be a part of that effort. So I accepted the generous offer from Wake Forest University, and I carved out my own human cognition research path. This is now an official pathway within the neuroscience program that students can select on purpose. I embraced my GAD, and I found a way to make it work for me. One of the problems with GAD is that we think about all of the things that could go wrong, all of the what ifs. Well, I used this anticipatory anxiety to inform my experimental design and to guide the writing of my research protocols. And this, I wrote some comprehensive research protocols. And even though they're over 10 years old, they're still being used in the lab. For my dissertation, my research examined how self-proclaimed worriers process threatening information differently from people who worry less. Although many of the studies that I designed did not yield the results that I expected, I came to accept that failure is a part of science. And this time around, the failure felt different. It wasn't some magical, esoteric skill that appeared and vanished overnight. This was honest science at its finest. Failure to reject the null hypothesis. That's how it goes sometimes. Today, I am proud to be a neuroscientist working in industry where I get to help researchers push the limits of their fields. It's really exciting. I still have GAD with the added complication of being intimately aware of changes in my neurocircuitry. I still have to get pap smears, and I still don't like them.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you, Tammy. Here's what I want you to do. Yeah, we can give Tammy a round of applause. I want you to reflect on any observations you made in yourself as you listen to Tammy. And it could be anything. There's not a right or wrong in terms of this question. Any observations, anything that came up for you? Maybe it was, I related to this part of her story, or, I was curious about this part. And if you feel willing, drop it in the chat or just know for yourself, what did I notice about how I felt, what I observed, questions that came up. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to think about that. And if you want to drop something in the chat room, fantastic. And then we'll talk about it a little bit. Yeah, very moving. Someone said, I felt the emotions. Fantastic. Someone says that they can relate. They were raised by a worryaholic. Mm-hmm. To fail. Mm-hmm. Empaths. Failure is actually a good thing. It also reminded me of my 18-year-old daughter who has anxiety and doesn't react to meds well too. Yeah, absolutely. I related to that as well, Tammy. It felt relatable because it included things that are also, it's going really fast. Also things that they went through as a woman and a graduate student. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think Tammy could talk all day about some of those issues. Yeah, very intimate detail that was shared with us, brave to tell. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes to grad school dropout fantasies. I think I also had those fantasies. I think I don't want to alienate anyone, but I think most normal people have those fantasies at some point going through grad school. Yeah, and I see a bunch of these, so I'll let people kind of look through some of the chats. So horrifying for you to go from being so good at what you were doing, and then suddenly you couldn't do it anymore. You stayed. So much courage. Yes, absolutely. I'm going to reshare my screen as people continue to share in the chat because I'm seeing some patterns here. All right, so maybe two things that come up for you, and I think most of them are in the first category here, empathy. So as you were listening, and I kind of guided you into that, I know I said, did you relate with her? How did you feel? But many people, when they listen to stories, they empathize. And there's research showing that we do feel empathy when we hear someone's personal story. Okay. So you might have empathized, and that might actually change how you interact with Tammy. So you can imagine if you sit down with Tammy at a conference luncheon, and when you go to these conferences, you sit down, you don't know the people, and she either tells you something very cold and aloof about her research versus she tells you this story, how it might change the dialogue that happens between you two. And I think it also might change the kinds of questions that you ask her. So if Tammy sits down at a luncheon and says, I'm going to get it wrong, Tammy, I apologize. But if she sits down and says, I study the threat perception and startle response in people diagnosed with GAD, and I used to be in patch clamp cell something, you might be like, okay, and I'm going to go get some seconds and not want to talk to her. Whereas if she sat down and said, yeah, I got into studying anxiety because of a pap smear, you might be like, whoa, okay. But it might also start a different kind of dialogue that might actually raise questions that are interesting. And then if you're in a different field of study, you might actually raise questions with her that she hasn't thought about. And I think that it creates this kind of back and forth dialogue that is not only empathetic, but can drive the science forward as you start to talk about some of these questions. So those are two things I hope that you might notice about yourself as you're listening. Okay. You all have stories. So we listened to Tammy tell this story, and it was in kind of a performative way. We planned it that way. So Tammy prepared the story. But all of you, every single day, have told stories, whether you realize it or not. It is how we communicate as human beings. You've told a story in the past 24 hours. You're all storytellers, and you all have stories about your science or your research or something that you've done within the sciences. Okay. Today, we are going to give you some time to reflect. This is the how part of the webinar. We're going to actually give you a little bit of space to dig up some of those stories, okay, and to see that they are stories and to develop them in these kind of mini bursts, okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to pull out a piece of paper. I'm going to pass it over to Tammy in just a second, and we're going to give you some prompts and let you sit with them and actually reflect and write a little bit to help you get some creativity juices flowing to see some of your own stories in science. So Tammy, I'm going to hand it over to you and let you lead everyone through some of these prompts, okay?
Thank you, Lisa. Great. So if everyone can pull out a pen and paper, if you are old school and want to do the analog way, or if you're in front of your computer, which you are, and you want to open up a Word document, let's go ahead and do that. And we're going to walk through a short exercise to get you thinking about your own scientific journeys. Everyone ready? All right. Well, to start, I'd like you to answer a few questions. Answer them honestly with the first thoughts that pop into your mind. We'll start easy. What do you study? Go ahead and write it down. Now I'd like you to think about, how did you end up in this line of research? Maybe you fell into it and somebody handed you a research project. There's no shame in that. Or maybe you had something happen to you or to a loved one that motivated you to pursue it. Go ahead and jot down a few notes or bullet points. Doesn't have to be a complete thought or sentence. Do whatever feels natural to you. We're going to give you 2 minutes to work on this, and I'm going to set a timer. So I'll just be quiet, let you think about this, and check in with you in a little bit. Okay, about 30 seconds left. All right, go ahead and finish up any last minute thoughts you have. And we will go ahead and shift gears a little bit to think about a happy, or no, we're going to think about the difficult moment, or 20. In science, we've all had these moments, and as uncomfortable as it may be, let's go ahead and think about one of those moments. Maybe you had a difficult relationship with a mentor or colleague in the lab. Maybe you were sick and tired of your experiments not working. Maybe your paper was rejected. Whatever it is, see if you can drop yourself into that moment and make a few notes about what happened. Do you remember how you felt when you were going through it? Once again, we're going to put 2 minutes on the clock and give you some time to think about this. Okay, about 30 seconds left. Okay, just a few more seconds to finish up any last thoughts. And we will wrap up and shift gears to a happy memory. Let's all think about a discovery that we've made. Maybe you discovered a new event-related potential or a new species of shark, or maybe you discovered something personal about yourself as you were doing your research, like you have generalized anxiety disorder. Let's spend a couple minutes here reflecting on this moment. About 30 seconds left. All right, that's a wrap for this portion. Great job. So by completing these exercises and answering these questions, you have all begun to craft 3 short stories. Let's take about 30 seconds to think about how that felt. There's no right or wrong answer. If you would like to share it in the chat, we'd love to hear what you have to say.
So we'll give you about 15 more seconds just to reflect on how it felt to remember some of these moments. Fantastic. If you want to share in the chat how it felt to reflect on that and to take a moment to actually write about some of those moments, please do. We find that people tend to relate to one another in terms of how it felt, even though you have vastly different stories, right? Fantastic. Connected to my research, absolutely. I'm actually better as an oral storyteller than a writer. Me too, Tony. Yeah, so writing them is a bit more difficult, but to get me talking, I'm all good. Fantastic. I agree. I'm a total oral storyteller as well, Tony. Fantastic. Okay, so where do you go from here? And I'll let people continue to write in the chat. Please continue to read and make connections with each other. I'll read a few more. It made my path more interesting and it constructed some motivation that I sometimes lose while stressing. I realize that these things are stories that we already have to tell to justify what we're up to. Yeah. Okay, so where do you go from here? So what we've done so far today, we spent a little bit of time in the beginning telling you why you might want to tell stories and why in particular today, true stories, to share your science with the public, but also potentially to share your science with other researchers. Then we listened to Tammy share a story to get a feel of what that would even sound like, a research origin story, right? And then we spent a little bit of time allowing you to get your creative juices going, just to have these little, dip your toe in the water snippets of what would it be like to find your own stories. So what do you do now? I think there's 2 things that we want to challenge you to do. The first is think and ask yourself, have I told anyone any of these stories? Have I told anyone these stories? Have I told the public when I'm talking about some of my research and my discoveries? Have I told a grad student? Have I told my advisor? Have I told anyone these stories ever? If you haven't, what we challenge you to do is go out and tell one of these stories. Now, it doesn't have to be a whole 10-minute story the way Tammy did it. We constantly are telling snippets of stories. Tell someone a 5-minute version or a 3-minute version. And what I want you to do is to see how that feels, but also notice how the interaction then unfolds when you share a story with someone. So that's the first thing to do. The second thing is maybe you said, okay, y'all got my creative juices going, but I don't feel like you actually told me how to tell this story. We're going to give you a couple of strategies right now, and then we'll give you some more information about more training if you're interested. So the next challenge is I challenge you to try to develop these stories further. All good stories have 3, maybe 4 components, okay? Those components are, I will list them first, and then I will put them on the screen as a good teacher. They are tension, characters, a pivotal moment or a climax, and then many stories, at least in Western society, have a resolution or an ending. So tension, characters, a pivotal moment, or what we sometimes call a climax, and then an ending or a resolution, okay? As you start to develop your stories, ask yourself, where is the tension? Is there tension in my story? Who are the characters? And they should be characters that people are invested in. Maybe it's me that's the character, but also remember, a character could also be an idea or a question you're grappling with. And what is the pivotal moment? What is that climactic moment in your story, right? I will put these up on the screen So what I'm showing you, you don't have to read all of it. I'm going to send this to everyone here today. Okay, we have developed a science storytelling toolkit, but here's the secret. This is actually the 4 components of any story, even if it's not a science story. But what we've done here is we've broken down these components of tension, characters, pivotal moment, and resolution, described what they are more broadly, and then said, here's what it might look like in a true scientific story. Okay. I will send everyone this after today. If you want more training, and this is the moment where we're going to plug some other workshops and tell you that we do more training than this. So we frequently do free workshops because we feel it is a service to the community to give you information about storytelling, to provide the space for you to reflect and to infuse your life and your science with storytelling. But if you want more training, we have 2 workshops coming up. Okay. So you want more training, we have 2 workshops. So the first is a week from today, this one right here, Storytelling for Scientists. Okay, this is a workshop that is aimed at true storytelling. So if you came in today and you're like, this was cool, I came up with 3 ideas for a story, but you're talking about these 4 components and I don't really know how to, like, what do you mean infuse my story with those components? You might consider signing up for this workshop. Tammy will be teaching this. She's going to lead you through an activity during that workshop that will blow your mind because it will automatically infuse your story with these 4 components. And then it'll be an activity that you can take and use over and over again to develop more stories for science and just broader stories that aren't even about science. That is going to happen next Wednesday at the same time, a week from today. We have limited seats in that class, just so people know. I think we have room for 12 people total, and we have a few people signed up already. So please go sign up. John is going to drop a link for that workshop in the chat. And he already did. Fantastic. Now, if you are like, you know what, you mentioned data storytelling and we didn't talk any about data storytelling today, but I'm so interested in how to beef up my research presentations and use storytelling components with my data. I'm teaching a workshop next Monday. So this coming Monday, December 5th at 11 a.m. West Coast time, 2 p.m. East Coast time on data storytelling. It's a super intense 2 hours. So you come and I basically give you tons and tons of information for 2 hours. And we have a few people signed up already for that. I would love to have people join us. There's QR codes for both. Again, John has dropped in a link. We have limited scholarships. We try to make sure that scholarships go first to students. So if you're a student and you're like, I can't afford these, let us know and we will try to pull together some of the scholarship funds for you. And someone said, will you teach these again? Yes, the answer is yes. I think our goal is to try to teach them at least twice a year, if not 3 or 4 times a year. And Elizabeth asked if these are free. They're not free. Each of these are $60 to enroll. And again, if you're a student, email me. You can either email me at lisa@capitalstorytelling.com. I will put that up in a moment, or at capitalstorytelling@gmail.com. And we will move over scholarship funds for students to make sure they're able to take it. Okay, so we are almost over time. So as a final kind of closing thing that we like to do, I think I like to do it in my classes. We like to do it at Capital Storytelling. Pull out a pen and paper. Tammy's going to lead you through a closing activity before we head out. That's right. I see that, John, too. John, thank you. John's dropping some more info in the chat room. Tammy, take it away. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Lisa. So as we wrap up today's session, let's just do one more brain writing session. So pull out a pen and paper or your Word document, and let's spend 30 seconds thinking about your experience in today's webinar. Let's go ahead and answer a few questions and write them down. What did you learn, and what will you do next? If you'd like to share this in the chat, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, this can be for your eyes only. All right, we'll just give you a few more seconds to wrap up any final thoughts as you reflect on your experience. All right, Lisa, I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Well, we are so excited that everyone came today. I know people are having to leave because you might have been on your lunch hour. Thank you for coming. John also dropped in. Capital Storytelling, we are a larger organization than just science storytelling. We actually have a mission of social justice and social change and using storytelling to do that. We have a lot of free events. So we have an open mic storytelling event that happens every month. It's donation based or free. If you can afford it, we ask for donations. If you can't, we want you to be there. And our next one is happening this Saturday. John dropped a link in there. So if you're interested and you're just like, I'm interested in storytelling, period, not just science storytelling, we'd love to have you there. Other than that, we hope that if you see someone in the chat, in the participants, that you know someone, you'll link up and you connect with them. But thank you for being here today. We hope that we see you, if not in an upcoming class, we hope we'll see you in an upcoming event, free or otherwise. So thank you for being here.